This year marks the 325th anniversary of the Salem, Massachusetts Witch Trials. Between 1692 and 1693, men and women suspected of witchcraft were jailed, put on trial, and executed. And now, historian Margo Burns discusses primary sources from the trials compiled in a book project she managed titled Records of the Salem Witch-Hunt. 12 people worked for 10 years to complete the book, a chronological record of legal documents from the trials, many newly transcribed by the team's 6 linguists. This hour 20-minute presentation was part of an all-day Salem State University seminar on the legacy of the witch trials.
Okay, welcome back. I'm Tad Baker, and I'm thrilled to see you all here for what should be a really interesting session. I'd like to introduce to you my good friend and partner in witchcraft studies, Margo Burns. Margo is one of the leading experts on the witch trials, one of the editors of the incredible records of the Salem Witch-Hunt. And in some degree, she's probably forgotten more about the individual documents than I'll ever know. And we asked her here today to speak specifically about those records and the amazing things you can learn from a close read of the Salem Witch Trials. I should also mention that Margo is the author of one of my absolute favorite and most important articles on the Salem Witch Trials, which really looks at the whole issue of false confession that I strongly recommend to you as well, too. So, Margo Burns.
Thank you, Tad. And just so you know, I have a completely different read on the coercion of false confessions than he gave to you just a few minutes ago. So read my article and you'll find out. I'm here today primarily to talk about the actual documents and how do we know what we know. One of the things that Tad was doing was quoting from here, there, and everywhere. And I'm going, oh, I know where that came from. I know where that came from. Which document is that? So whenever I read or hear anything about the Salem Witchcraft Trials, I always try and go, let's go back to the primary source. And this is Records of the Salem Witch-Hunt, and it's about the size of a ream of paper in a hardcover. It does now come in paperback, so you don't have to pay $150. You can pay about $50 and get one that's in paperback. If you are serious about studying the Salem Witchcraft Trials, I heartily recommend getting one. Just so you know, there were so many of us doing this. I don't get a penny in revenue from it because we had to split it 12 ways. The history of this book, you'll see Bernard Rosenthal, absolutely amazing man. Tad mentioned his book, Salem Story. He's actually a literary critic. He was the head of the English department at Binghamton University, Melville scholar. And when he discovered Salem, he's also very interested in social justice, and he thought it was a great injustice what had happened here. And as a literary critic, he started reading the primary sources, because that's what literary people do. You read and say, what did they actually write? And the end result was Salem Story. He also discovered that there were a lot of mistakes in the transcriptions of the documents, and he got caught up in a couple of them, and he said, wow, it'd be really nice to change and fix all those things. And that's when he embarked on this project. He did not realize it would take as long. He was figuring 2 or 3 years. It took 12 of us 10 years to do this. And when I saw this book, as heavy and hefty as it is, I got it in my hands. I said, is that all it is? Because we'd taken so long. Including Bernie, his first project manager was supposed to be Joe Flibbert, who was a longtime professor here at Salem State, who tragically passed away just as the project was starting. And I don't really know how it happened, but it happened that Bernie found me right when he was about to start working on this, and he took a huge chance on me. And later on he'll say, oh, I knew what I was doing. No, he didn't. But it worked out very well. When you talk about the 12 people, the other 10 include 6 linguists from Scandinavia. Well, why linguists? They can read old handwriting. They're historical linguists, and they're used to dealing with primary sources that are handwritten. He didn't think he could find anybody here. He was in Finland and said, oh, I don't think I can find anybody. And the first person he talked to was a man named Risto Hiltunen from Turku University, a linguist who was interested in reading the transcripts of the interrogations. He said, oh, I know where they are. They're over in Helsinki. So the next person they talked to was Matti Rissanen from the University of Helsinki, got him on board. And one of his colleagues, Mirja Kito, who is now at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, So the three of them came on, and they each brought a younger colleague, Matti Pekkola in Turku, Lena Kalastarka in Helsinki, and Peter Grund, the only Swede among them, at the University of Uppsala. So it was an interesting crowd to work with. I was very happy that I have a master's in linguistics so I could interpret, because people who are interested in literature and people who are interested in historical linguistics don't have a lot of common ground. In addition to these people, we had some Americans. Gretchen Adams, who has written a definitive work called The Spectre of Salem, tracing the use of witch hunt as an epithet, mostly in the 19th century. And of course, right up until this week, we still use it. We also had Benjamin Ray, who you probably know, the website at the University of Virginia. Also, he's got a book. I believe the e-version gives you a portal into his website. Pretty nifty. Richard Trask, who you probably already know over in Danvers, and our very own Marilyn K. Roach, who you will see and hear, who I think is just, anybody says, oh, you know more than anything, anybody, Margo, and I said, no, no, no. Marilyn Roach is the person. She has been doing this longer than, well, maybe not longer than Dick, but that didn't come out right. But Marilyn is just, she knows so much, and she has looked at absolutely everything. And she was just invaluable in this because she'd say, oh, do you know about this document? And she ended up writing the thumbnail bios for everybody in the book. And it was just a Herculean task. So we are very indebted to her, and the whole team was just an amazing thing. And the fact that we actually finished it in less than a decade was amazing. So Tad has already given us an overview of what happened, and I'm not going to repeat all that. What I'd like to talk about is the actual documents. If we're going to talk about what happened, if you've ever heard me talk before, I do go in depth into what it took documentary-wise to do a whole case. So this is my one-slide summary. There were basically three phases to any case. The first would be an investigation. That's when somebody would complain. The magistrates would send out a warrant, have the person arrested, and they would interrogate them, sometimes in public, sometimes in private. And if they decided that, well, yes, there was grounds for holding them over, they would hold them over, and a jury of inquest, a grand jury would be called. They would look for facts, so they would summons people. They would have dead bodies examined. They would look, especially in witchcraft trials, they would look for the existence of witches' teats. It was very similar to other kinds of trials. For instance, there was a case in the 1600s of a woman who was accused of infanticide, having a bastard child and killing it. And it's not in the witchcraft trials, but they empaneled a jury of women to examine her body. And they came back and said, well, this woman hasn't given birth. So no baby, no death. But this is the kind of thing that they typically would do, finders of fact. So in this case, especially the thing of looking for witches' teats. After the inquest, the grand jury could decide whether the charges were true or not. This is when the actual charges were being made. And they would write up, the Crown's attorney would write up an indictment specifying those things. And the grand jury would then look at it and say, well, we believe this is a true bill. The crime took place. We think there's good reason to go to trial. Or they would say, well, no. And then my favorite word in all the documents is they would write on the back, ignoramus, we do not know. If they found it to be a true bill on the indictment, then it would go on for prosecution. You would be arraigned, and you could plead guilty or not guilty. Well, most people don't know, but 4 people pled guilty. They did not have trials. They went right to sentencing. But you could plead guilty or not guilty. And when you hear the story about Giles Corey getting pressed to death, there was another phase there at the hearings, and that was you had to agree to be tried before God and the country being the jury. And Giles Corey said, no. And that sort of put things to a halt because it was all the steps that you would have to follow to do this, and he was throwing a monkey wrench in it. So they found that very strange old torture that would end up in his death, that would press him to death. If you were tried, in this case, everybody who was tried in the Salem trials was found guilty, and you would, within short order, be executed unless you were pregnant, or in case you had pled guilty, they were going to give you a little bit of time to make your peace with God and do all the things to clean up your act before they were going to execute you. This last one is actually the death warrant for Bridget Bishop. And the seal is William Stoughton's personal seal. And he's the only one who signed it. So that's the basic thumbnail for a case. To learn about this, we went to look at all the documents. And the original manuscripts are in about 12 different archives. When we first started out, the one on the left is a digitized image from microfilm. A lot of these things, if you go to the Mass Archives and you want to see documents, they point you at microfilm first before you get to look at anything. So I believe it was Ben Ray who got a little grant. He's great at making grants. And he had all the microfilm digitized. So immediately we had some things, and that just sort of made my little heart go a quiver. Oh, manuscripts. But within short order, you know, we're looking at these things and they're not great. So Ben and I went to a lot of trouble to go back to the Phillips Library at PBD Essex, where most of the documents are, and photograph and scan them. And you can see a big difference. The one on the right, this is one of the indictments for Rebecca Nurse. And yeah, you should be able to see it. It's nice and bright. You can see there are two colors of ink. That was something that was immediately apparent to us that wouldn't have been from the microfilm version. And it's sort of like, what's going on there? Guess what? Even in those days, legal documents could be boilerplates, and one person made the boilerplate and somebody else filled it in. But it's all handwritten. But those are the things we could see when we looked at the actual manuscripts. Volume 135 at the Mass Archives was an actual book, a bound book of documents that were all silked into the pages. You'd have a page with a cutout, and they would put the manuscript in between two layers of silk, so you could see both sides, kinda, through the silk, and you could actually page through them. But the microfilm, they didn't even have the master anymore. They just had the one that was in circulation. And you can see it was horrible. Poor Gretchen, she was trying to transcribe from these, and her eyes were going crazy. She was using Photoshop, all sorts of things. So finally I went down and I got permission, and I tell you, the people in the archives of all these places were fabulous for us. And I photographed them all. At that point, they were all still in the book, and I had to shoot and shoot. Most recent time I've been down there, they have taken the book apart and put each of these in its own archival folder, as they should be. They're still silked, so the couple of them that have wax seals, the silking goes over the wax seals. So they're not optimal, but they are preserved. This allowed us to make better transcriptions. We also, in addition to original manuscripts, there were a lot of things out there, facsimiles of manuscripts, that we did not know where they were. The one on the far left is a negative photostat of the interrogation of Abigail Hobbs. Well, why do we have this? In the early 20s, a lot of people who had interesting old documents would go to libraries and historical societies that had a photostatic copier and say, hey, I got this interesting document, you want a copy? And the actual positive of this one is at the Mass Historical Society. So I already knew it. They have a collection of photostatic records. And the book at the Massachusetts State Archives, when I opened it up to photograph those things, this fell out. It was tucked inside. And I went, I know exactly what this is, but who knew it was here? I was hoping it was something we hadn't found yet, but no. The middle one is from a 1936 catalog selling this particular document for $85. If you remember the news a couple years ago, there was another witchcraft trial document that came up for auction. It went like $30,000. God, an investment of $85 in 1936. What I could have gotten. The one on the end is from a 1904 book, and this is the only version we had of it, kind of tattered. While we were working on it, Dick Trask somehow tracked it down, and it was at the University of Michigan. So you never know, in some cases, where these are. And we don't know where that document for Abigail Hobbs is. There's a little bit of provenance at the Massachusetts Historical Society, but not much. We also discovered that we had handwritten contemporaneous copies of things. So on the left, we have one, and then on the right, it's basically an account of the same interrogation, both in the handwriting of Samuel Parris. We have no idea why there are two versions, except that he was taking things down in shorthand and then reconstituted them into his accounts. Shorthand was very, very useful for a young minister because they could go and listen to some of the divines, Cotton Mather, Increase Mather, and use shorthand to take down absolutely everything and then reconstitute it. And that is one reason why we know so much about Salem Village, why we know so much about the pleas of innocence, because Samuel Parris took it all down. There's a reason that Arthur Miller poached from him is it reads like a play. She says this, he says that. Oh, there's sound over here. We couldn't hear. The girls were flailing around. All those descriptions come from Samuel Parris because he was reconstituting it from his shorthand. And if I could find one of those documents, I'd love the shorthand on that. But he sometimes made two copies. We had to figure out which one was actually used, and we don't know why there was a second. We also have some handwritten contemporaneous copies. If you look at the one on the left, clearly first draft. We say several different people crossing things out and adding things, and then the cleaned up copy on the right. The challenge, we haven't figured this out, is that the mark at the bottom of the left one, the messy one, looks like an actual mark from the person signing it. You didn't necessarily have your signature, you might have a mark. And so it looks like that's the actual signed one, but the other one is cleaned up. So why we have these contemporaneous copies, we're not really sure. We also have some later handwritten copies, and the one on the far left is actually a tracing of one of the documents that was out in public for a very, very long time. The original is now pretty tattered, but I was looking at it saying, this is the same as the other. And then I went, but it's not fluent. What's going on? I finally held him up. Somebody had actually gone to the trouble to trace the document to make something new. So this was in a different archive. This is down at the Boston Public Library. So they thought they had an original manuscript, but who knows when this tracing was done. The second one is a copy of Samuel Parris' interrogation. It maintains the same line structure and the same layout on the page with the two columns, but it was done later. There were little things with errata. Oh boy, librarians and archivists like to include little tidbits to say when things are wrong. And then the one on the far right is just another copy of some of the old records. So we had to tease these things out. What is it we're looking at? There are also things that we don't have manuscripts for. And these are published transcriptions of documents that we don't have any. The one on the far left is Deodat Lawson's account of some of the days in April in 1692 when he went to visit and find out, gee, was his wife murdered by the specters? And that came out pretty quickly, so there's a lot of information in that. Then the next one is a decree from 1692. Those things would be written out, but then officially published. The third one over is from Caliph's account from 1700, where he's describing a lot of the things and really taking to task everybody that was involved, especially Cotton Mather. So there are things in there that we don't have any original manuscripts. When you hear that Rebecca Nurse was originally found not guilty, this is how we know, because he has accounts in there from her and from the jury foreman saying that they were pressured to go back and bring her in guilty. So, and then the last one is a page from Governor Thomas Hutchinson's history in the 18th century. And he had taken a lot of the original manuscripts home, and he was writing this history of Massachusetts. And there he has transcriptions of all sorts of documents we don't have today. 3 words actually: Stamp Act Riot. His whole house was trampled, and some of the I've heard, one of those, maybe it's fake news, I don't know, but that his library was trampled, and some of the draft pages still were dirty. They just trampled everything, and so a lot of these documents just disappeared. At one point in the 1900s, there was a man named Poole who discovered that they had an earlier draft of his book, and in that earlier draft there were snippets of other documents we didn't have. So we're slowly but surely putting together all these pieces because we don't have everything. In 1840, Thomas Gage published a history of Rowley, Massachusetts, in which he has 9 documents in the case of Margaret Scott. Margaret Scott was executed. I bet very few of you even know who she is. You might have seen her bench, but there are only 9 available to tell her case. And 2 of them are in the Essex County Court archives that the Phillips Library holds. And then 2 of them are ones that are in private collections. And if you hear about an auction of one, those are the 2 indictments that pop up. But there are 5 more. And where are they? Well, 4 of them are in the Boston Public Library. After our book was published, Peter and Matti and I were pursuing some, well, we were trying to figure out if we could identify more of the handwriting in these documents. So we did archive hopping for 2 weeks. And we went to the Boston Public Library to go to the Rare Books and Manuscripts room to see if they had any contemporaneous manuscripts that we could then maybe identify handwriting, because we've been doing this in our book. And at one point, we were looking up all the towns, because that might be helpful. So Peter opened up one of the drawers of the card catalog. Card catalog. Okay. And this is March 2012, 5 years ago, card catalog. And he was looking up Rowley, and he said, "What do you think this means?" And the card said, "4 documents in the case against Margaret Scott." And my heart skipped a beat. I went, oh, we only have 9. Maybe we'll go up to 13. Well, actually, it turns out these are 4 of the 5 that we didn't know where they were. Yeah, okay, we already knew the text, but because we were really looking at the manuscripts, it was really nice to see the handwriting, see all the things, because quite often these older transcriptions didn't look at absolutely every mark on a manuscript. Sometimes on the back side, they wouldn't copy that stuff, but we did. We were looking at everything so we could try and figure out the date, who wrote it, because one of the big things about records of the Salem Witch-Hunt is that Bernie was determined to set it up chronologically. And the handwriting sort of came a second thing, because when we were all transcribing, if you had a document with about this much of somebody's handwriting, and you have an ambiguous area, you don't know quite what what that says, it would be helpful if you had a couple of pages by somebody in their handwriting and you could compare and resolve the ambiguity. Well, so we started sorting early on so we could keep track of whose handwriting was where. And anybody who's spent some time with the documents will be able to identify Samuel Paris's handwriting, Thomas Putnam's handwriting. But beyond that, we really wanted more. And to be able to actually see the handwriting, this gave us a little bit more information. Just a side note, Peter went back about a week later just to take a look at them again, and they couldn't find them. And they were very apologetic, but they couldn't find them. And remember, this is around the time that Margaret Scott indictment had just gone up for auction and brought in about $30,000. So we were, uh-oh. And they said, well, we'll find it. We'll let you know. A month passed. I made a call. They were really ticked at me. We told you. We would let you know when we found them. And I'm going, every day that passes is not good. And so I pushed, and I was homesick for a couple of days. And I said, I'm going to make some phone calls. And sure enough, I went one up the chain. I know somebody used to work there. I said, is this the right person? And she said, yeah. So I called her, and by the end of the day, they had gone through and they had found them, and she called me back. So a couple of years later, when you heard about the Rembrandt and the Dürer, you remember that one that had gone missing?
Isabella Gardner?
No, this is the Boston Public Library. It made the front page of the Boston Globe. The Dürer was worth over $500,000. There are a couple of etchings or engravings. The Dürer was worth $20,000 or $30,000, and they lost them. I sat there and went, they just misshelved them. They're gonna find out. They're just misshelved. And when it was, I went, yes, I knew that would happen. But it caused a lot of tumult at the Boston Public Library because people said, why do they even have these things? And, well, shouldn't they know more about their collection? And I'm thinking, card catalog? But I double-checked yesterday, and it turns out their rare book and manuscript department is closed until 2019 as they're going through to re-inventory and do improvements. So I'm happy to report they are responding to that, but I was going, oh, there's stuff I need to see. I have to wait how long? But anybody who's been around for the Phillips Library move, yeah, how long did we have to wait to have access back to the Phillips Library content? there were other transcriptions going along, and Arthur Miller probably used Woodward's Records of Salem Witchcraft. This is a page from it, came out in 1864, and Woodward's crew went in and transcribed most of the stuff that was in the Essex County Court Archives. So this is a page from Tituba's examination, and see, I tell you, it reads like drama. But I want to draw attention to this one, where Tituba is saying 2 rats, a red rat and a black rat, had talked to her, and I'm going, rats? Oh, that's an interesting one. And you know, here's a term. And some of the stuff that I'd been reading had said, well, Tituba was talking about rats and cats, and I'm going, that's odd. Why rats and cats? So here's a little piece from the document, and they're, you know, red rat, black rat. Okay. Well, at the time that Woodward was doing it, he did not know that there was another account of this examination. This one is written in the hand of Ezekiel Cheever from Salem Village. This particular one is at the New York Public Library in the Thomas Madigan collection. These old libraries often started rare book rooms from these collectors, these antiquarians who would put together nice documents. And this is Jonathan Corwin's account. And if we zoom in here, I saw 2 cats, one red, another black. What did these cats do? And you could see that curve, cats. It's definitely cats. And I'm going, 2 guys were at the same time. One says cats, one says rats. Did they just hear it differently? You know, how do we resolve this? So a lot of people have then said, oh, she saw cats and rats. Well, let's take a look at this. Is it rat or cat in Ezekiel Cheever? And you say, well, it kind of looks like rat, doesn't it? Until you look at some of these other things. The devil reigned to me? No, it became to me. The child, I don't know how to pronounce that with an R. The children, these are unambiguous instances of that letter, and these are unambiguous C's. So Ezekiel Cheever was hearing cats. There are no rats at all, but there are all these transcriptions out there that say rats. We also encountered some other things. This is a piece in Thomas Putnam's handwriting, and the traditional transcription of this is on the 15th May, 1692. And I looked at it and went, I've seen the calendar. The 15th of May was a Sunday. Why would they do an examination on a Sunday? They have better things to do. And then I looked at it again, I said, I think that might be an 11. The 11th would be more appropriate. So then I went in search for more examples of Thomas Putnam's handwriting, and look at that. 45. His 5, it takes 2 strokes and is definitely a 5. And the unambiguous 1 in 1693, he just made little curly ones. So we were able to correct that date, absolutely. But we had to make a case for everything that we did. When we were looking at the different sometimes we called them recorders, sometimes scribes, sometimes a hand. We couldn't come up with exactly what we were going to do. But I made a whole database that was available online. And we had examples of different people's handwriting. And then we had some profiles, what some of the features were that helped us recognize that person's handwriting. And then a list of the documents that included that person's handwriting, so that we could refer to it to make our transcriptions better. And that was the original reason for doing it. Eventually, we had so much information, we said, we have to share. So if you look at the entries in Records of the Salem Witch-Hunt, you'll see in some cases we identify whose handwriting appears where. And we have that really ugly bracket, hand 1, hand 2. Every single document starts off with hand 1. So it's a little more detailed, I think, in some of these transcriptions than I, as a reader, can sometimes bear, but it has particular meaning. And you can find out most of the people, about 24, 25 people that we came up with and identified in the book. However, we found over 200 variant hands as we went through. And most of them have really weird names. Like if you see the 4th one down, unidentified scribe W. Oh, I want to know who scribe W is. We have not found out. And when we were doing our archive hopping, I was determined to find out who scribe W was. And I had a couple of links. Didn't find out. We call him scribe W because his lowercase u looked like a W. And if you look at some of the older transcriptions of things, they've actually transcribed it as a W. It isn't. But I want to know who he is. I'm sure it's a he. And it was somebody who's involved in the grand jury proceedings. Don't know who he is. I found his handwriting in other contemporaneous documents. Still don't know who he is. So we kept track of all of these. When we're looking at the features of a particular hand, these are just shots from our database. We were looking at things to describe an overview. For instance, with Samuel Parris, I would say a very small, cramped hand. Orthography, which is the big word for spelling. Some of the spelling was really particular. Thomas Putnam, who wrote over 200 depositions for all sorts of different people, could not spell the word witch. It was W-I-C-T-H. I don't even have to see his handwriting to know it's him. If I see something that's transcribed, W-C-T-H, oh, Thomas Putnam again. And also instead of persons, he spelled it with an A. Parsons, there were some very distinctive spellings that will tell you who the person is. The letter forms, probably how most of us will try and match up handwriting, and there were common things like E's and R's and capital letters. So anything that was distinctive that could help tell apart two different handwritings. Punctuation, you don't necessarily think of punctuation as something that could identify you, but Simon Willard loved colons. He loved colons so much, sometimes there's a colon followed by another colon. And then there'd be a word and another colon. It was sort of like, why do you wait 3 words to put another colon? I have no idea what his colons mean. But if I see a document that's got lots of colons, it's Simon Willard. And then abbreviations were really critical because we use a lot of contractions with apostrophes, and they weren't doing it that way then. Most common, of course, is what most people say, ye olde, whatever, the Y-E. It's actually, the Y is actually a thorn, and it stands for TH. And then the superscript E, that's just sort of an abbreviation for the. And there were a lot of different ways to do that. An abbreviation for that would be that thorn Y with a T. And sometimes they do a W with something. It just, they would put these things together, and how they made their abbreviations was quite telling. And some people would use that thorn E, ye, and other people wouldn't. And there were other abbreviations that people would use, whether they use superscript or whether they use something called a macron. If you write the word common, if you handwrite it, there are a lot of loops in M's. And sometimes they would do one M and then put a line over it. That meant make 2. And so that would be well, you know, otherwise you're going, just too many loops. So they could use that as an abbreviation. So there are a lot of particular styles, and we could keep track of what a person's style was for doing abbreviations. So these were all things we were playing around with. And of course, the documents were co-created by a lot of people. So any given document might have several people's handwriting in it. The numbers you see, ECCA, that's Essex County Court Archive, Volume 1. Very early on, we had our own custom names for them. So you're seeing some of the stuff behind the book. These became different numbers in the book when we decided to do the chronology. And that was a challenge unto itself. But so you're really seeing the behind the scenes piece in here. The hands in the documents, because we were looking to make sure we got good transcriptions, we also kept track of a word count. Because if you were looking for a big chunk of text by a particular person in their handwriting, it was really nice to know. So we kept track of that, so you could go look and say, oh, do I have a good example of somebody else's handwriting, and give me a bunch of it. Then also, whether we were going to include them in the book. And we had parameters for inclusion. And we ended up saying we had to have the person's name, and it had to be a significant contribution. It couldn't just be, yeah, we know this person did it because they wrote it and signed it. That wasn't enough. We were looking for the big players. We were looking for Parris and Putnam. We were looking for anybody that really you would recognize as one of the people. And I think we got 24, 25. It's been 8 years. I don't remember if it's 24 or 25. So we had lots of things that we were doing behind the scenes. When we finally got to do the book, everything's in chronological order, and this is the first entry in the book. It's the warrant for the apprehension of Sarah Good. That's the document on the left, and then the transcription on the right. One of the things when we're doing the chronology is that not all documents, you didn't just sit down and write a date on it. That was a little tough. We have a lot of documents that don't have dates on them, plus they were co-created over time. So this one on the front is the warrant. It was written on February 29th. However, it was handed to the sheriff to go get her, and on the back he's saying, okay, I brought her in on the day you requested, March 1st. So here we have a document that has 2 different dates associated with it. 2, how do you put that into a chronology? So we just kept track of how many dates we had. And you notice I've got 6 slots because I said, well, you never know. We only got to fill up 5 at one point. But we just kept track of what are the dates, what was the function of this piece in the document. More commonly, there are things of evidence. And this was used at 3 points in time. This is one of the pieces by Thomas Putnam. This is a deposition of Mary Walcott against John Willard. And we have one piece here that seems to, everything dates from May 8th and earlier. And that's the deposition, the evidence that the woman was turning in. Then we have this next thing, which is the oath. At the grand jury, you had to swear to the truth of your testimony. So when we see one of these, we know that it was used before the grand jury. That's also scribe W. My friend, at some point, I'm going to find out who that was. And then there's the last piece that says jurat and curia. And this is a notation that was used on a document when it was used at trial. And the trial was in August. So we've got 3 different dates, 3 different handwriting. So we've got Thomas Putnam, we have scribe W, and we have Stephen Sewell, the clerk of the court. And that's what this looked like in our database. I had a bit of a struggle with Bernie. Bernie is a very linear kind of guy. He likes putting beads on a string. And when you have to rearrange them, that's kind of hard. And I managed to wrestle him away from that a little bit so that we could look at each individual document separately, and then I could string the beads for him. It was tough for him because he's a real linear guy. And at the end, when I produced the book, I think I made 4 different versions. I have an algorithm for creating the book. And I'd print the whole thing out, and he'd read the whole thing, and then see if things went together right. And finally, at the end, he and I spent 2 days on Skype. When I say 2 days, it was 8 o'clock in the morning till noon, break for lunch, 1 to 5, break for dinner, 6 to 10. 2 days in a row on Skype, going through absolutely every single decision that we made and checking our algorithm to make sure that everything was being ordered absolutely perfectly. And when you see all the entries in here, that is exactly what my algorithm put out. All the cross-references, all of the notes, taking from all sorts of things that people had included. Because remember, we had 6 people in Scandinavia doing things. So we had to have a common place to do it. I want to bring you back to this document, though. And here's the testimony, the deposition. This is what she was saying. And you've got a pretty good read on this. You can see that the top is sort of in brown ink, and the bottom is in gray ink. Here's a little line. I was sitting in the reading room at the Phillips Library and with Dick Trask and Bernie, and Dick was going, this is interesting. It looks like an ink change. And we're looking at it, and if you've ever worked in an archive, they only give you 1 document at once. You only get 1 at a time, but there were 3 of us. So we each ordered up one of these documents that they happen to have several of, and it turns out we found a whole bunch of them from Thomas Putnam that have that 2-ink quality to it. And if we looked across the different archives, we found more of them. I don't know if there are like 15, 16 of these that occur out of the 200 that he wrote, but they all, curiously, the ink changes in a particular spot. I mean, you can understand if perhaps he ran out of ink and just started up with a different batch. You can see that. You know, you hear whinnying and hoofbeats, you're going to think horse before you think zebra. But the curious thing across these documents is they all started with also on the, and they have a date, being the day of his examination, I was most grievously. They all started out with the word also and named the date. This is really critical because almost every single indictment, the crime itself, is listed as the date of their examination. That was because the crime that was witnessed by all these people, because that, remember when Tad was saying you had to have 2 witnesses to the same criminal act? Well, during their public examinations, the things that were happening, and the girls were supposedly afflicted right there, again, air quotes, everybody could see that. So they weren't tried on the crimes they had done before they were arrested. They were actually charged with what they'd done during their examinations when they were in custody. And this piece below there adds in the information that will support that charge on the indictment. It adds in all the stuff that happened that day, and so it really will support the indictment. And then, of course, it got scribe W confirmed that. So this whole piece was added, we posit, to support the indictments. As I said, one of the things we came up with had 5 dates. Poor Ann Foster. Oh my goodness. In the middle of July, over in Andover, they were relentless. And she started confessing, and they kept going back to her again and again. So we had actually 5 different dates associated with that particular document. So that's why I was really glad I had 6 spots. Always try and have a little more room just in case. One of the things you may notice on these is there were the types of uses, because within a particular day we needed to be able to sort what's the order on a particular day, because there are a lot of things happening. And we wanted to make sure that we could put things in the right order. We wanted to keep the officer's return with the warrant or with the summons. We had to keep things together. There were all sorts of pieces here, there, and everywhere. So we had about 60 different types of uses. And you may see officer's return, but what it was connected with. All these different, arrest warrant and return the same day, arrest warrant, return on a different day. So this could help my algorithm. We had all this information of what function and what part in time does this particular piece of this document have. This is a lot of fun, I have to say. This just warmed the cockles of my heart doing this. What kinds of questions can you ask, though, with all this information about the handwriting and the time? Because these are 2 big pieces of records of the Salem Witch Hunt, the chronology and the handwriting. Well, there are a couple things you can do, and one of them is figure out a pattern of participation in the events. So probably the person who gets blamed a lot for the Salem Witchcraft trials is Samuel Parris, the minister in Salem Village. So we know his handwriting, and most people do, and a lot of the documents actually have his handwriting on them. But if you go through and date them, they all show up in one place. I passed out the handout with this timeline. The pink area is before the court was actually seated. This is the time when people kept accusing people, and Hathorne and Corwin say, okay, we'll hold them over. By the time the court was actually seated, there were 60 or 70 people already in custody. All of the things that Samuel Parris did, all those documents and the interrogations that he did accounts of, everything was in that time period. You don't see him going forward. So we take his handwriting and we take the timeline. He was only doing things at the very beginning, before the official court even took place. We see his handwriting again a couple of other times later, but those are mostly just to swear oaths on his testimony. But if you really want to see when Samuel Parris was doing his stuff, that's when it was. They kept going. They didn't need him to do this anymore. And actually, if you take a look, and this is the other timeline that is in your handout, each one of those spikes is a day. And it tells you how many people were caught up on any given day. How many people did they snatch up? So that first yellow one on the far left, that would be Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. I've color-coded this a little. There were a lot of towns that were involved in his, but the ones in yellow are the people from Salem Village. The ones in green are from Salem Town. The ones in black are all other towns. But I'd like to point out that the yellow and green are really on the first half, and red is Andover. So you can visually see that there were 2 phases to this whole episode. And the total of Salem Village and Salem Town is less than the number of people in Andover. So when we talk about the Andover aspect of it, and it changes a great deal in quality and the kinds of accusations. But remember, see that March, April, May? That's when Samuel Parris was involved. I'd like to also point out that big spike. There's one that's higher than any others. That was a particular warrant right before the Court of Oyer and Terminer was instituted. And it's sort of like they said, have we missed anyone? And there's this warrant for all these different people. And that's when you get the warrants for Susanna Martin and John Alden and all these people that maybe had a reputation or had some legal history. So that's why you see that spike. When I started putting this together, I went, oh, I like this chart. I like it a lot. I love timelines. I've got another one in the works that I can't wait to start showing people. But I like nailing it down to individual people and watching the whole piece, because when you're talking about over 150 people being wrapped up in these accusations, it really is hard to suss it out. You really have to see it over time. You have to see so many. It's a multivariate data set, and trying to come up with ways to think about it. It isn't just like, and then there were all the people in Andover. But it wasn't just like all at once. We have all these people in Andover. It unfolds over time. One of the other things we can tell about Samuel Parris is we can see who else's testimony his handwriting appears on. And it's one thing if you have his own testimony and he signs it. One thing we discovered was that at the top, that's Samuel Parris's document saying who he was accusing, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. But the one on the bottom is Abigail Williams' testimony against Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. I'd like to point out one other thing. This is one of the first pieces. This is her testimony, and if you look very carefully, there's stuff that's crossed out. And existing transcriptions sort of skipped over the crossouts and the corrections. Peter Grund, again, has written a whole article about the corrections in all the documents. Like I said, 12 people, 10 years. People were looking at little teeny details. But looking at the actual documents, when you get a magnifying glass on that, it's sort of like it separates out into 3D. Underneath that, it says Elizabeth Parris Jr. and Betty Parris, and she's been crossed out. And in the other pieces, it says testify. Well, that would have been for plural. You know, Betty and Abigail testify. In very, very light ink, you see TH. So it's Abigail Williams testifieth. And then also right underneath the big crossout, it changes they to she. And on the one on the far left, it changes there to her. So this document is where Betty Parris drops out of everything. It's the only time you see her in any kind of thing. And she's been dropped out probably around May the 23rd. She's probably too young to be a formal accuser, but also they were trying to get her out of the limelight, maybe. There's anecdotal talk that Stephen Sewell's family took her in, she got better. Marilyn Roach has written a great thing about Betty Parris, about her whole life. She went on and get married and have kids. But this is where she disappears. There are a lot of these sets where Samuel Parris and you see the little dot, dot, dot on that? He would grab two other guys. A lot of times it was Thomas Putnam, but Nathaniel Ingersoll, but he'd put his own thing in and then he'd grab a couple of other guys so they'd have multiple adult men making these accusations. And then there's the parallel one that he has written for Abigail Williams. So there's Martha Corey, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Proctor, John Proctor, Susanna Martin. There are a few other ones where we have just her or just him. We assume that there are a lot more of these pairs. Clearly, these are the early ones. As I said, we don't have all the documents, but this was enough of a pattern to say, wow, he's just doing Abigail Williams, and nobody else did Abigail Williams' testimony. As I said, Thomas Putnam had written over 200 depositions for other people, for which I got a very nice paternalistic pat on the head from John Putnam Demos for telling him something about his ancestor that he didn't know. That's my one meeting of him, and basically, oh yeah. Hey, it was good. At that same conference, Ben Ray and who's the other at Tulane? Dick Latner had produced papers that were challenging some of the data that Boyer and Nissenbaum had used to make their decisions, and John Demos didn't like it. He told them, Boyer and Nissenbaum had a big idea. It was sort of like, how dare you criticize Boyer and Nissenbaum? They had a big idea. And I'm sitting there, but they got their data wrong. Wait, they cherry-picked the data? Oh, they got the map wrong? That would seem to be important to me, but they had a big idea. And it was something that changed how historians were doing work. They were actually looking at the communities. They were looking at those relationships. So they did have a big idea, but their data is flawed. So John Demos didn't like that, but I got a nice paternalistic pat on the head. The other thing, when you're looking for patterns of participation, this is a close-up of my timeline on this. We know that Thomas Newton was the first Crown's attorney to be prosecuting the cases, and then a little later on, Anthony Checkley came in to do it. So we know about this. Thomas Newton left, because the province of New Hampshire was opening up, and his job, it turned out, was to be the treasurer of the new province. And at one point, because the state archives is right down the street from where I work, I said, I wonder how that went. And I kept finding document after document of him trying to get somebody to give him the ledgers of the province so he would know how to manage the money. And he's all these complaints. They wouldn't give me the books. They wouldn't give me the books. And I'm going, okay, there's an article in that sometime. So he went up to New Hampshire and was trying to do things. So he was out. We know their handwriting because we have a couple of documents. The one on the left is a letter that he wrote to Isaac Addington in May of 1692, and the one on the right is a petition by Anthony Checkley in 1693. He was in a very awkward position of having conducted all of these cases, and they never paid him. And he's trying to figure out how to do it because he's representing the crown. He's the crown's attorney. And if it was somebody else that the crown had been stiffing for their fees, they would be trying to sue the crown, except he couldn't sue the crown because he was representing the crown. So he's in this tough position. He'd done all this work and they hadn't paid him. So he wrote a petition saying, you know, this is the case. Is there anything you can maybe do? But he couldn't actually sue and be on both sides of it. So we have these two wonderful examples of their handwriting. And one of the things that came across, and we know these are the guys, one of the things that came across is we could find where their handwriting showed up. And we had a couple of dates. We knew that Newton came in on June 2nd, and we knew that Checkley came in on July 27th, because we have the actual commissions for what they were doing. When we started looking at the indictments, and I'm sorry, indictments are probably the most boring documents in all of these, until I discovered they were boilerplates. They revealed a whole lot more than you really know because you were looking at the handwriting. And the one on the left, we saw this earlier, this is one of the indictments about Rebecca Nurse that we can see filled in the blanks. And the one on the right that's a lot crinklier is an indictment against Abigail Hobbs in September 10th. And all the fill in the blanks are done by Checkley, which is really kind of, you expect that. And saying, okay, now part of a pattern of participation. You can see one of the things that the Crown's attorney does is fill in the blanks on the boilerplate indictments. Except that, love that, there are some that don't have either of them filling them in. Sort of like, really? Who is this? And it turns out we also know who the handwriting of that was. It was Stephen Sewell. He was the clerk of the court. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, when did this happen? So we discovered that when we looked at Thomas Newton, his handwriting only appears in the indictments for the first 3 cases. We get to Anthony Checkley, he doesn't even start doing things in July. He's starting to do things in early August. And then Stephen Sewell, the clerk of the court, has been working on the indictments in the middle. He's just the clerk. He's not the Crown's attorney, and yet he's serving that function in this time between when Thomas Newton left and Anthony Checkley had started. And you would think that you would see Anthony Checkley and all those ones that came in early August, but clearly Stephen Sewell was still shouldering a lot of it. And he did George Burroughs. He did all of these people, and we don't know if maybe he even acted as a Crown's attorney to present those cases to the petty jury, and with disastrous results for the people involved. We really don't know. And I don't know what to tell you about this, other than it's a pattern that I discovered looking at handwriting and time. And I leave it to somebody else to try and figure out, is this significant or not? I think it's significant, because if they didn't have an actual Crown's attorney doing this, I don't know. It raises questions for me, and I hope somebody else can possibly use this as a starting off point to see, why was this the case, that they actually allowed them to continue before they had a formal Crown's attorney to continue the prosecutions. So that's a question I'll leave you with, and I'm happy to take questions. I've taken you on a bit of a romp around things, but I hope I've given you some ideas and maybe have fueled a couple questions. Yes, make sure you get the microphone, please. Oh, yeah.
Was Stephen Sewell a attorney at all?
No, basically even Newton and and Checkley were not really attorneys. I mean, they were appointed as such. In England, they had a much more of a profession. And you were in the bar, and you had training, and there were a lot of different kinds of ways you could be a lawyer, a barrister, or attorney. And we didn't have that formally here. You'll hear a lot of people saying, oh, but we didn't have attorneys, or they were illegal and things like that. We didn't have the kind of structures that they had in 17th century England. In England, all stuff for medicine also had lots of structures. Whether you were a physician, or you were an apothecary, or you were a barber surgeon, all those structures for the professions in England did not come over here. So maybe somebody had a little training, but it wasn't like they were getting the same kind of training that somebody in the bar in England was having. So they were the only ones who actually were lawyers in any sense of case, but we didn't have the adversarial kind of thing, so nobody was represented by a lawyer. It was just the lawyer, the Crown's attorney, was presenting the case to the grand jury and petty jury, putting it all together to present them. Yes? Wait for the mic. The camera crew likes me because I do that.
I imagine you get used to working with these documents after 10 years, but what was the first Salem witch trial document that you held? And was there a particular one that made it real in that personal way to you to be working with?
I can tell you which one of the documents caught me first, and I can tell you which document got me into this whole thing. And I don't say this when I'm talking to middle school kids, but the one that caught me was the description of the search for witches' teats. And I was reading it, and I'm reading a description of my ancestor, Rebecca Nurse's genitalia. And I went, holy cow, why do I need to? It looks like she had a prolapsed uterus, but how come I'm knowing gynecological information about my ancestor? And that sort of caught my attention. So I don't generally say that when I'm talking to middle school and high school kids. But that's the one that made me go, what else is there? The document that really got me into this was that document where you saw the two versions of it, the corrected version and the clean one. There's a curious piece of that, because that's a document of testimony against George Burroughs. I was reading the 3-volume Boyer and Nissenbaum Salem Witchcraft papers, and I came across it, and it said, it's a testimony against George Burroughs, but the date on it was a month after he had been executed. Oh, wait. So that's when I contacted Bernie, because I knew he was starting this project, and I said, is this one of those errors you were saying occurred? And he said, well, no. I did talk about that in my book. I'm going, huh. He said, but there's something I want to talk to you about. And it doesn't work very well on email. He doesn't really like email. And I found out later on. I said it would be easier maybe if we talked in person or on the phone. I don't know if you're comfortable. I said, fine, I'll just call the guy. And that's when he needed a project manager. And he invited me to come on. Because I think I was asking one of those questions that was at the heart of Records of the Salem Witch-Hunt. The other document, that when I was actually holding it in my hand, because those other two were just records, was these documents, the indictments against Rebecca Nurse, and the account of her interrogation in Samuel Parris's handwriting. And holding a document that you know who actually wrote it down and the context, and it's about your ancestor, it was just like, oh, this is basically part of what caused her execution. I know who wrote this document. I sort of felt like I could be in the same room because I could identify all this handwriting. I knew who these people were because they were writing things, and this is right in front of me. And I don't think you have to be a descendant of somebody who was executed, but that had resonance and reverberation for me, that I knew who it was and what he had written down and what the end result was from him writing that down. So, anybody else? Dad, wait for the microphone, please. Yeah.
So an observation and kind of a question. I guess I'm sort of intrigued too by the whole Stephen Sewell and all the Parrises, Reverend Parris, first Betty, then Abigail, and also Samuel, all kind of disappearing early on. And I think I think there's a lot going on there. I mean, particularly, I'm intrigued by the fact that there is this relationship that Stephen Sewell's sister-in-law is Paris's first cousin, so that makes perfect sense. But at the same time, too, when you actually read the documents, there's no real proof that that's where Betty went. I know you sort of alluded to that.
It's anecdotal. It's anecdotal.
Makes sense, and it's clearly clear that he's trying to get the girls out of the trials, I think.
But still, Stephen Sewell?
I know.
Especially when we learned this, that he's taken over and he's running the cases. So, I don't know, there are a lot of questions. For me, the documents are the heart and soul. And you've seen that some of them aren't actual primary sources, are already secondary sources. So for me, anecdotal means I can't really come up with the primary source. Also, just because it's a primary source doesn't mean it's true. Because, you know, as Tad was mentioning, Phipps writing back to the Crown and said, oh, I was off on the frontier. And then Tad discovers, oh, wait a minute, he's listed in the people being present at the governor and council how many times over the summer? He was there with the guys who were running the trials. So, but politician, liar, okay. You can't necessarily believe everything that everybody says in these things. You just know the record is they said it and somebody wrote it down. So, again,
Got to follow up on that.
yep, you got to follow up.
All right.
Shouldn't have run away.
But the question, could you tell the audience and give us your impression of that Burroughs document? Because it's one of the ones that I think is the most intriguing, the one that was written, deposition taken a month after he was executed. Could you tell your take on that?
Part of it was it was Thomas Green, I believe, just off the top of my head. He was related to Ann Predator, and it was around the time that she was being accused, and some of the discussion that some people have is that he was trying to help her out by giving extra information about Burroughs. Burroughs, his execution was very controversial. This is a minister that they had convicted and executed. So some speculation is that, and I think that's Bernie's speculation, that he was trying to do something with the court, just try and curry a little bit of favor with them. But it's a very curious document. As I said, it's in Bernie's book. So I'm gonna go back here. Yeah, got the microphone? Yay, Innocence Project, yes. All right.
Okay, a lot of the books that I've read about the witch trials and so forth use as their sources Pearlie's 4-volume history of Salem, and I believe it's Upham or Upton, Charles Upham. Do you have any sense of what primary documents they were able to look at?
They were probably looking at a lot of the same ones, probably just the ones in the Essex County Court archives, because as I said, Woodward's records of Salem Witchcraft came out in 1864. So that was probably the definitive published resource at the time. They probably also could walk into the courthouse and actually see the documents. But Woodward it was a 2-volume set in about a couple of decades ago. Da Capo Press republished it in a 2 volumes in one. Also, you can get that as a PDF at archive.org. It's so neat now, all the stuff that you can get in free PDF public domain things. But those earlier antiquarians, the antiquarians did a whole lot to collect things, and they also, you know, Upham sort of made up some stuff. If you've heard about the girls dancing, let's see, Tituba teaching them voodoo and the girls dancing in the woods, there's no information before Upham tells that story. Sort of like, what? And you know, there's just absolutely nothing before that. You would think there would be something, but Upham came up with this. So each generation brings to all these primary sources the things that are pertinent to them. So when you hear that Tituba was voodoo practicing, she comes across as a voodoo practicing black mammy from Barbados. They knew she was a slave and from Barbados, and there was witchcraft. So suddenly, but you look at that, it's in the Civil War era. Northerners think slave, Barbados, witchcraft. They have a stereotype of a voodoo practicing black mammy from the islands. And Tituba was an Indian. And we really don't see that she did anything other than her husband mostly used a English white magic recipe for making the rye cake with the girl's urine and feeding it to a dog. That's English white magic. But she got recast in the context of how people saw the world in the Civil War era. And every single generation brings to this material their own stuff. I mean, we have Arthur Miller. Suddenly, it's all about the anti-communist things that are going on in McCarthy. Of course, I read The Crucible and I say, interesting story about marital infidelity. And it has a little veneer. It's about Salem. No, it's not. He uses the specific details, and I wish he hadn't used real people's names. It makes it very confusing for a lot of people because he's renamed a few, he's conflated a few, but used some real names, and it's a constant challenge because people find out about this story and they're interested in Salem because of it, and you have to detangle it to get back to the primary sources. So if he had just given them other names, I would be very happy. But as I see it, it's a story of marital infidelity.
Arthur and Marilyn.
So if you look at that way, and people say, oh, but it's about the communists here. I said, well, you know, maybe. That's probably informing it. Marital infidelity. But everybody wants to have it be about Salem. And Tad already brought up the fungus among us. The fungus that dare not speak its name. That was a theory that was published first in the mid-70s by a graduate student named Lori Capral. And she had written it as an undergraduate paper. Here she was, a science major having to take a humanities class. And she thought this was interesting because there was mid-70s. I mean, Timothy Leary and dropping acid, the electric Kool-Aid acid test from the 1960s. When she found this out, I mean, that was on the minds of people. Drugs, hey, they were tripping. And as soon as her article got published in Science magazine, boom, it made every single wire service. And we say, how long did it take to get refuted? Stephen Nissenbaum refuted it like the next day, but it had made all the wire services. I really want to give a whole talk on that at History Camp next year. So look for, if you come to History Camp next year, look for either the fungus that dare not say its name or the fungus among us, and I'll have a lot more details, and it's a lot of fun. But every era brings to it their own. Mine is the coercion of false confessions. That's one of my favorite parts of this, is because I can tease it apart. And unlike just about everybody, including Tad, I think they were planning to execute all the people that confessed. I think Stoughton had it. Stoughton was, and he's the court. So I make a case on what happens. I draw on a lot of the stuff. You see you have a Project Innocence Project shirt. I've drawn on a lot of the research on how that functions to apply it to what we see in the primary sources. And they were heavily trying to get people to confess, because it's much easier to convict them if you have that confession. It's a gold standard then and now. So, questions? Wait. Yes, you do have to wait for the mic. You're welcome.
Could you comment on the, I heard both of you mention people giving, I don't know if it was a deposition, but remembering things that being visited by the specter of someone, or hearing something from someone's spirit. Could you explain what that is?
Spectral evidence.
Yes.
The basic premise of spectral evidence is that a person, a witch, could send their spirit, their image, their specter from their physical body to somebody at a distance, whether it's across the room or into another house, to do their afflicting. So you could be standing right there. Rebecca Nurse is standing there in custody, and the girls would claim to see an image of her specter, coming across the room and strangling them and poking them and trying to knock them down. And nobody else in the room can see this. But the girls who are accusing these people are claiming they see it. Now, the first one will say, oh, she's afflicting me. And all the other girls will go, yes, I see, she's afflicting her. And everybody else is watching and going, I don't see anything. But they start believing what the girls are saying because they're so passionate about it. And I tend to think it's sort of like teenage girls. If you have a group of middle school girls and one of them says, oh, there was a bug on me, how many other girls are going to go start looking for bugs? And next thing you know, oh, yes, I'm being bitten. It just, when we talk about the mental state of people. So as soon as one girl says, oh, yes, her specter is afflicting me, the rest of them concurred. And part of the reason that I think we have all those indictments that are dated for the day of their examination is so many people witnessed that. Even though they didn't see the specter, they saw all the things that led up to the girls claiming affliction, all right there. Invisible things like specters were also like ghosts. Ghosts appeared to people and claimed they had been murdered. But the other piece about the specters, and this was controversial at the time, as to whether the devil could use the specter, the image of an innocent person, to attack somebody. Because that would be, I mean, the devil's a trickster. You know, and the court, and when I say the court, I mean William Stoughton, believed that the devil had to have the permission of somebody to use their likeness or image as a specter. So therefore,
was a big respecter of law and order.
Yeah, but the devil couldn't do it with an innocent person's image. Couldn't have that afflict them. So that was a major legal point of dispute. And there were a lot of people who would bring up the Witch of Endor, and they were looking at biblical things. But if a girl claimed there was a specter of Rebecca Nurse afflicting her, the court saw it as Rebecca Nurse had allowed the devil to use her image to afflict. Therefore, it was evidence.
Okay,
Yes.
so my follow-up question to that is, the court seemed to operate in a loose fashion if they were allowing people sitting there to suddenly burst out with things. You know, you can imagine that today maybe they'd say, oh, take that person out, they're disrupting the proceedings or something. So could you comment about that?
Because it wasn't really the kind of court proceeding that we're used to, when you've seen portrayals of the questioning and answering, we sort of imprint it from what we know of Perry Mason and Law and Order, and any instance that we have seen of some kind of legal thing going on, and it looks like, you know, Hamilton Berger interrogating the perpetrator, when really that wasn't the case. These were pre-trial hearings, and that's when they did interrogations. I'm more likely to call them interrogations than examinations, although you'll see the word examination a whole lot. It's a public interrogation. It was more like Lenny Briscoe going after somebody. And even today, police, when they're interrogating, operate from a presumption of guilt. So when you see those questions that Tad had up there, why do you afflict these girls? They're all leading questions, because they've already concluded you're guilty, and they're going to do anything they can to elicit a statement against your self-interest. So all of these seem to be court things, but these were interrogations, and that's when I said they're trying to find out the investigative part of it. And so it wasn't that uncommon. The girls did, however, come to the grand juries and were at the trials, because we have some instances where during grand jury hearings, the girls flipped out again, and then when Rebecca Nurse was found not guilty by the jury, apparently the girls really flipped out there, and it was very, very noisy. And Stoughton sent the jury back out. They came back and said she was not guilty. They sent her out again, and Stoughton said, well, what about when she said X, Y, Z? I can tell you the whole thing, but I'm just shortcut here. What about when she said this? So the jury said, well, what did you mean there? And it was so noisy, she couldn't hear, because the girls were just flipping out. They were finding her not guilty. And when she didn't answer, because she didn't hear she was being asked a question, the jury said, okay, because failure to respond to an accusation was tantamount to agreeing to it. And if you think that was old-fashioned and what were they thinking, it's still the case. It went to the Supreme Court only a few years ago that if you are asked a question and you refuse to answer, that can be used as evidence against you. So then and now, there's so many parallels between what they did then and now. But the reason that it could get so chaotic is that by the time they got to the actual court hearings, they were used to having the girls there. But early on, they were just part of the crowd. So anyway, question?
So you laid out this speech with the three documents, three phases of the trial. Were the complete cast of characters there for each event, or were the judges brought in for the third part, or were they there for all the other parts?
Well, in the investigative phase, that's when you mostly got the local magistrates like Hathorne and Corwin, and they were the ones that would be called in to just see if there's a reason for arresting people. And one of the things that's really interesting about these is that they traveled to Salem Village to hear these complaints. They didn't make everybody go into Salem because it was much easier for them to go there. But then they stayed, and the longer they stayed, the more people said, oh, by the way, I think this. So they were trying to figure out, how do we handle this? And every single person that was brought before them, with one exception, they threw in jail. And the only exception was Nehemiah Abbott Jr., and he was a young guy, and the girls had started giving physical descriptions of people, and they said they had a wen on his forehead. A wen is a bump. Thank you to all. You're welcome to everybody who does Scrabble and crossword puzzles. Wen, W-E-N, as a bump. And they said he had a bump on his forehead. And when they brought him in, they had to brush his hair aside, and voila, no wen. And I'm thinking, teenage guy? Okay. That part of acne went someplace else, but he doesn't have it there. And they let him go because he didn't match the description that the girls had. After that, Mary Beth Norton brings this point up a whole lot. She said, after that, the girls didn't do physical descriptions. They said, well, how did you know it was Goody Martin? Well, she told me her name and that she was from, sort of like, what? Yeah, the specter who's afflicting you identifies themselves. This is how you know. It's sort of like, yeah, I'm going to hold you up, give me your wallet. Oh, by the way, my name is, you know, all those things of stupid criminals who leave their a check deposit slip when they rob a bank. It's sort of like, who does that? I mean, essentially, they made out that these witches really worked against their own self-interest. And I think that's another reason why they thought they could get them to confess. Very easy to get these people to do that. So you want to ask another question? Come on up.
I wanted to ask, partly, was there anything to learn from the paper, the ink, the things that were not the handwriting, et cetera? And I was wondering if you could debunk something that I heard on some popular program.
Well, for starters, we didn't look at the paper. There was lots of paper with, he's going to follow up that question. Don't go away. Okay. We looked at the paper, but we decided that was outside of our scope. But there are a lot of watermarks and things like that, so we probably could have gone farther with material culture. The ink they probably made themselves, and there's one document that the pen was so sharp it just poked holes in it. So they were making their own pens, probably just with quills, and mixing their own ink. But beyond that, nothing. But you had a follow-up question, which was?
Which was? I heard recently, I don't know from where, that someone had a theory that Paris received a copy of Pinckney's book on trying witches and used what was in it to coach Tituba's, quote, confession not too long afterward. So I was wondering.
You saw the National Geographic special.
So.
Yes.
I don't remember.
Yes, it was a couple years ago. Tad and I were both in this thing, and Catherine Howe, the author, talked to all of us, and I remember watching that and going, really? Actually, when it came out, I was going, oh, National Geographic, this is awesome. And then when it came out, it was couched between Mysteries of Shrunken Heads and The Witch Doctor Will See You Now. No joke, those are the two that it came out in the end, they have Catherine traveling to, I believe it was the Mass Historical Society, yeah, and there was this copy of this book on how to prosecute witches, and there's an inscription that it was given to Paris. The date was the date of her interrogation, so I can't imagine him being able to read that whole book on that day, the same day that she's being interrogated, and know what to do. I tend to think if this was the case, it was probably a follow-up, oh, you should see this. But I don't think he had time, unless he stayed up late with his Kindle reading it, that he was going to be able to read that whole book and use that information to work on Tituba. Tituba was a slave. Tituba had nothing to gain. If people told her, confess, she was going to confess. The easiest people to convince to confess falsely are people with no agency. So a slave, small children, servants, they're easy to coerce. So it really didn't take much. And Tituba's is probably the most fantastic and bizarre confession. But I'm sure she was just told, you did something, so she came through. She came through big time. So. You're welcome. I don't know if we're out of time, but any questions?
One last question.
One last question? Anybody? All righty. Well, thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.